Well, great to see you. Tonight is a big night. It's a big issue, and I'm wondering where you're all at. How you feeling? Is anyone nervous? Is anyone kind of worried about what he's going to say? Will he embarrass us in saying what he's going to say? Will he make us angry? Will he make me angry? And I'd just offer that the answer to all those questions is yes. That's right. It is the reality that people be here in different contexts. Some of you here because you are actually quite hurt, concerned, angry about racism in the world, and you might have expectations. You're hoping that I'll actually really put the boot in about racism. Others of you are here for almost an entirely different reason. You're angry about the way the world is responding to racism, and you've got very firm views already on it, and you're hoping I'll put the boot into those that are running amok around these issues. And so just be aware, we've got people from very different backgrounds sitting amongst us. And actually, there's some of us here just because you heard me say this is the most important thing for 25 years and you're terrified and you've come along. So you're wondering what's going to happen as well. You can settle in and enjoy it. But racism, let's jump in. There is a problem. We're not America, so the nature of our issues here are different. The history of slavery and segregation and so on in America does shape very profoundly the context there, which is somewhat different the context here. But we do have our own issues. Do you realise that it's only 1973 that the White Australia policy was taken off? That is very recent history. Many of you grew up through the White Australia policy. There are many generations that were shaped by that. To think that Australia was to be a British culture and continent. That was very much the intention from certainly the Second World War through Labor and Liberal parties, interestingly. And it's not a surprise, therefore, that ethnic minorities in Australia find Australia racist. That's not a surprise because of the nature of our history. But more deeply, we do have one community of group that is truly disadvantaged. And I've chosen to take responsibility for this, and let's see if I can make it work. It's the Aboriginal community. Did you know that they suffer 2.3 times the rate of mental health issues, 2.3 the burden of disease, 1.8 the risk of disability. Their median average age at death is 20 years lower than non-Indigenous. They are horrifying statistics. They're really quite dreadful. And added to this, or beneath all this, is fairly historical pain. Britain came to Australia and settled here, and now we're the recipients of that movement. The hard work of many of those early pioneers and so on, the development of Australia, our country has benefited hugely from all of that. But the British took the country from the people who were already here. They thought it was no one's land. There was a theory at that time called terra nullius, which means the land belongs to no one. And it was a very common view at that period of history. But that was wrong. Mabo, that very famous case back in our recent history, engaged on that very issue and demonstrated that it was wrong. The Aborigines had settled regions, they had tribal lands, they had hunting patches of ground. It was theirs when British people arrived. It wasn't registered with the British Home Office, but no one here, of course, thought you needed to do that. It was their country. So when the British landed, they pushed the original owners out, and some of that was very brutal. Much of it was very brutal, but some of it was simply the dint of superior numbers, greater technology, and pastoralists who were determined to make their way and gain a living. Now that history has left its scars in our country. 30 years ago, it's this year, I think the 30th anniversary of the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody, a very significant moment in our history. The thing that was found, it's a very big report, but you can read this in it. One cannot point to a common thread of abuse, neglect or racism that is common to these deaths. They investigated 99 deaths and so on. However, an examination of the lives of the 99 show that the facts associated in every case, with their Aboriginality played a significant and in most cases dominant role in their being in custody and their dying in custody. That is a hugely significant statement. Yes, they couldn't find that there was overt racism that led to the high rate of Indigenous deaths in custody, but what they did find and made much of was the Aboriginality fact that leads them to be in custody and the way they were treated in custody. You see, the fact that they were in custody and the fact of the way they were treated in custody was due to the state of the Aboriginal culture. They were in custody because they'd done something wrong, you see, though there is evidence of an overrepresentation of arrests for the same kinds of crime amongst Aborigines. But the fact that they were represented so massively in custody, and the numbers were quite staggering. 90% of the prison population in the Northern Territory was black. 80% in the Western Australian context. It was massive overrepresentation in custody. The fact that they were overrepresented in custody could be traced back, the Royal Commission found, to the arrival of European settlers and their treatment of the Indigenous people from that point on. This is the finding of the Royal Commission. This is important to note. Many Indigenous people are in prison because they've broken a law. But why are they offending at such high rates? Because of a dysfunctional state of Aboriginal culture. But why is Aboriginal culture so dysfunctional? Because of what British white Australia did to them. Now, this is horrible and shocking and deeply disturbing. And I fear that many of us find ourselves reacting in some defensiveness about it. But the evidence is very plain. It was theirs. British came in, occupied, took it, pushed them out. That's the history of Australia. Horrible, shocking, deeply concerning. But it isn't the most shocking thing about Australian society. Now, throughout tonight, I want to kind of lay down some teaching moments, sort of step aside and offer some other thoughts on the way through. And this is one of those. Think with me, what is the greatest crime that needs fixing in Australian society? Don't say anything. What is the greatest sin in Australian society? Hint, it's not racism. There's much that humans do to each other that's horrific, evil, wrong, terrible. Racism is one of those things. But racism is only a symptom of something much worse. Do you remember Jesus gives 2 commands? And he says the second most important command is love your neighbour as yourself. What is the greatest command? Love God with all your heart, mind, soul and strength. Follow this. It makes sense to say, doesn't it, that the greatest sin is to break the greatest commandment. The second greatest is love your neighbour. It's a horrible evil to do evil to your neighbour. But the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul and strength. Now, why is that the greatest command? It's not because he's precious and fussy and needy. It's because he's the source of the totality of our life, every one of us. We owe him everything. Life, breath, and everything else. Beauty, good, wonder, joy, gladness, relationships. He's the one who is most worthy of praise and glory in the universe. And he's the very one we've turned our backs on. And this is fundamental to who we are as humans. Ultimately, the greatest need of humanity, the greatest need in humanity, is to be reconciled to God. And the greatest evil in our world is a failure to treat God as God. Now, I'm aware as I'm saying that in our time, our culture, there are many who find that profoundly disturbing, that a Christian could talk like that a church would talk like that. Can we prioritise like that? Jesus does. Greatest command, the second greatest command. And why did Jesus come? He came to seek and save the lost, to give his life as a ransom for many. He came to restore sinners into relationship with God, back into relationship with himself. This is a vastly different way of seeing the world than our contemporary society sees it. The Bible sees our dominant relationship as the vertical one before it is the horizontal one. Our relationships with each other are secondary to this most important and greatest concern. Now, they're related. Our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. They're related in the way that the root is related to the fruit. But getting which is the root right and which is the fruit right is desperately important for our lives together. You see, think with me, why does racism exist? How did the fruit get so rotten? The fruit of our society life together, our social life together, where we treat each other so poorly. How did that happen? Well, it's not because of evolution gone wrong, though I've read some books that point this out, that kind of pick up the idea of tribalism, that's a kind of a evolutionary thing that was important to us, that's kind of maladapted into the way we live today. No. Why does racism exist? Because we have ripped our roots out of walking in submission to God. That's why it exists. It's poisoned everything, that one decision. Rebellion against God is the disease. Racism is the symptom and expression of that disease. In fact, it's possible to see it a little bit more particularly than this. We threw God off, not wanting him at the centre of our lives. We wanted to be at the centre of our lives. We, in our pride, wanted to be the ones who ran our lives, were sovereign over our lives, and so we threw the creator of the universe out of his place to take it ourselves. Now, if we threw God out because he threatened my personal sovereignty, think of what I'll do to you, a mere human, if you threaten my sovereignty, do you see? If I can do that to God, think what I'll do to you, especially if you're not part of my tribe and not part of my family group. Now, four things flow from this. Christianity challenges any reading of racism that makes it primary in any absolute way. The Christian faith does challenge any worldview that sees racism as the most important things facing humans today. Second, Christianity provides an explanation for its presence. Racism began because of our rejection of God, which broke humankind and produced a sin that poisons everything and poisons our horizontal relationships as well. You know, one of the things that, perhaps you're here tonight and you're not somebody who normally comes to church with us and you do wonder about the Christian things and so on. I want to suggest one of the things that's compelling about the truthfulness of the Christian claim, the person of Jesus, is its explanatory power for life. That is to say, there's all kinds of historical evidences, and in fact, tomorrow night you can come along and hear all of those. We've got a great event on live doing that. But the other thing that's powerful about Christianity compels its truthfulness. It is able to make sense and explain the world I live in. Why is racism here? Well, because it's a sin problem, not a tribe problem. It's a sin problem, not an evolution problem. That's why it's here, and that's why it's through every society and culture. Third, the Christian faith provides a solution. If the root being torn out of God poisoned everything to destroy our horizontal relationships and bring racism as part of the poison of our life together, what's the solution? It's to be restored back into relationship with God and to begin to produce the fruit that's in keeping with a restored relationship with God. Fruit, the fruit of love. You know, there's a wonderful part in the Bible, Ephesians chapter 2. I don't know if you've got your Bibles there, but you can flip open to it and have a quick look at it with me. Ephesians chapter 2 says these wonderful words that God's purpose in verse 15 was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. What he's talking about here is the greatest racial hostility between the Jewish people and the non-Jewish people. Not because Jews are more racist than any other nation, of course, but because this is part of actually the shaping of humankind. There was a massive hostility between those two groupings, those two human nations, if you like. And God's purpose was to bring them back together, was to unite them as one, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross. Do you know, the Christian faith is a wonderful, wonderful, powerful message that actually enables the root to be put back where it belongs, under God, in submission to God, reconciled vertically to him, such that it transforms everything about the way we live together. The gospel has the power to actually confront racism and transform our world, because God's very purpose is to bring people from every nation, tribe, language and tongue together. Do you know, just to say here too, that Christianity is not a white man's religion. You do realise that Jesus, the founder, was a man of Middle Eastern appearance. Do you know what I mean? He's not one of us, if you like, culturally. We've joined him, which means Christianity and reconciliation with God through the person of Jesus is for all nations. And it's a beautiful thing that church expresses this in a wonderful way together. You see, the gospel, the order of these things, root and fruit, is important. The gospel is not establishing heaven on earth and restoring all human relationships. The gospel is being reconciled to God. It's been reconciled to God. And that is a heaven and hell issue. You know, if you're here tonight and you're interested in racism, we'll get into that in a moment. But there is nothing more important than considering Jesus. You might be deeply concerned about the issues of racism around our world, and I think it's fair to be concerned about it. But the deepest problem we have, I have, you have, is not how each other treats each other, but our reconciliation with God, who loved us so much that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish. Can't help myself. I want to preach the gospel again. But from that root comes a transformed society. Be reconciled to God, and so produce fruit in keeping with a saved life. And the fruit that's in keeping with a saved life? Love. Love of your neighbour. If you care about racism and hate it as you ought, consider what part you can play in bringing an end to it. Love demands that you participate in that cause, that we participate. So, racism. What just happened? Yeah? Racism has always been around. Sin has always been there, and it's been a problem. Racism has existed all of this time. But racism seemed to many of us to be fading from the world. Do you remember this man, Martin Luther King Jr.? We couldn't get a photo of him actually speaking to the crowds because it's copyrighted, but here we go. Listen, if I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they won't be judged by the colour of their skin, but by their character. And didn't we all think it was getting there? Most of us did. Weren't we making progress? But suddenly it exploded again, and it wasn't George Floyd. Many of us are old enough to remember Rodney King. Do you remember that incident, which caused an explosion of riots through Los Angeles? There has been this thing simmering in the United States and here. The Royal Commission was 30 years ago. It's been here for a long time too. But there has been this thing simmering for many years. But things in the last 5 or 10 years, bang, yes, are you with me? Suddenly something happened. And it wasn't Trump. It was there before Trump. But he's certainly in the context of Trump, however you feel about him, his politics and so on. But what happened? Well, I'm going to suggest what happened. A thing called critical race theory. Have you heard of it before? Some of you will have, but most of you won't have. It's new to many of us. It's a set of ideas that are pretty amorphous. It's not sort of one big movement. It grew out of a bunch of thinkers decades ago, establishing a thing called critical theory. And we're not going to go into all the details here, but the group who kind of formed this critical theory idea many, many decades ago were concerned about Western civilization, Western society, capitalism and so on. And they were concerned about the inequalities that formed, oppressions and separations that occurred. Did you know that capitalism does form separations and inequalities? You know, the makers of monopoly, I understand this is true, monopoly was invented to teach people that capitalism, unfettered capitalism, produces and reinforces inequalities. Once you get to a certain point in monopoly, you can't lose and they can't win. And it's just another 3 hours of watching them smash you. Because wealth just accumulates more and more to the same group. Once you've got a few houses, it's all over. You know this, don't you? You've got kids. You all played it. And numbers of people have been concerned about that and have been critical of it and working up ideas to dismantle it and rebuild it and make sense of it and so on. Now, all of that thinking percolated into the university world, the clubs, the think tanks and so on for years. But in the last 20 or so years, it's gotten traction outside of that. And it's really fired, I guess, in the last 10 years. Now, here's the thing. Most of us won't encounter this thing called critical race theory as a theory. Some of you might, but most of us won't encounter it as a thing. In fact, you don't encounter wokeism as a thing. You don't encounter Marxism as a thing so much. Most of us rather encounter these philosophies in their various principles, in their key tenets. And my plan with you tonight is to take you through my sense of the key principles of critical race theory that are playing out culturally around us. Now, I'm not infallible. You might see other ways. You might pick up things I've missed, undoubtedly. But here's my take on it. So the first talk, what I'm going to do is take you through the 5 principles, if I understand them, of critical race theory and unpack somewhat what they are. Second talk, we're going to engage with it all again from a different angle, all right? So does it make sense where we're going? That's all been introduction. We've got a lot to get through, but how fun. Here's the first principle of critical race theory. Racism isn't what we used to think it was. Have you ever firmed up in your own thinking what you think racism actually is? I mean, don't say anything, but what do you think racism is? What's racism? Most of us, I suggest, would imagine, have thought that racism is acts of prejudice against a person from another race. Is that a fair definition? You say or do something that treats another person as inferior. You say or do something that disadvantages a person of another race. We think of it as an activity of an individual against another person. Well, the first thing to note about critical race theory is there's a new definition of racism. And it's called, well, that's what we used to think. The new definition is systemic oppression. That's my summary for it. Systemic oppression. Now, each word in that definition is important. Systemic. This new definition draws attention to the fact that racism isn't about individual actions, it's about systems of power. I'll explain all this in a moment. It's about systems of power that oppress. Racism in this new thinking is about one group, not merely individuals, one group oppressing another group from a context of power over that group, using or in the context of systems and systemic issues that are part of the culture they've created. You see, the essence of racism is not just prejudice against another person, but prejudice in the context of systemic power. Let me see if I've got this for you. Here we go. Thus, racial prejudice can indeed be directed at white people. White people can't dance. But it's not considered racism because of the systemic relationship to power. Now that needs thinking, because I tell you, I'll offer this, I think it's profoundly helpful. I'm going to show you how critical race theory actually has wonderful insights. It is really very, very helpful for us. You see, what this is demonstrating is that just noticing that a national grouping, a racial group, has characteristics that are different from another racial group doesn't mean you're being racist. But rather it's actions, words, and systems that oppress that racial group in the context of your own power in the society within which you live. This explains why black people in America can criticise white people and be quite derogatory and negative and not be racist. Do you see why? Because they don't have power. They don't have cultural power. They're not part of a system of power. Because racism, in this new understanding, is a corporate understanding of racism, not an individual understanding. Now, this is profoundly important. The old definition was entirely individualistic. Racism is what an individual did to another person. But this new definition notes the power of the corporate, the community, what systems do, and the part individuals have within that system. Now just pick this up. Most Westerners love the individualistic definition because Western society is, by definition, individualistic. And if you've been raised in an individualistic culture, you'll be attracted to anything that's individualistic in the way it sees and understands things. Whereas most ethnic groups see the corporate definition as the one that's most important because they feel the impact of the system. When you're in the system, benefiting from the system, you don't notice the power of the system. Unless you're a minority outside the system, you'll notice it then that there's a system. Now let me illustrate this from our history. The British arrive in Australia, and when they come, they bring a raft of cultural norms and patterns and expectations of life that's part of their British culture. Codes of behaviour, dress codes, the way you ought to dress. How you ought to make a living, it ought to be by farming, by agriculture, by manufacturing. Success. Their value of success is materialistic success, wealth, property, and ownership. Now, it's impossible for someone who values nomadic life, the hunter-gatherer life, to succeed in British culture. Not because individual British people are racist, but because of the culture that they bring has a set of values and norms and expectations that won't allow nomadic hunter-gatherers thrive. Do you see what I'm saying? Now, it's kind of okay, though, when there's room in a country for both communities to live their different way. So if there was space for the capitalistic, individualistic meritocracy of farming, hunting and so on to survive, manufacturing and so on to function, and a big tract where the nomadic, then it's all fine. But when the British progressively take over every part of Australia, they set up, not maliciously, they set up a culture, and this is key, that someone who values nomadic hunter-gatherer life cannot succeed in. And they are disadvantaged. Do you see? They are forever shut out. Their only hope is to let go of their cultural values and adopt Western values. That's their only hope to survive. Do you see? Herein lies the insight of critical race theory, which is hugely insightful. Hugely insightful. You see, oppression of white over black, because British were largely white, and so there's an identification there. The same thing happened in America, of course, colonisation there as well. But the oppression of white over black is not simply through individual acts of racism and abuse, though there was that. It's achieved simply by establishing a system, a language even, English. And the only way now to succeed in Australia is by letting go of your culture, to embrace this new people's culture and embrace their values, the Western cultural values. Now, some Aborigines did, and they succeeded. But they did it by sacrificing their values. Do you see? Now, this is why some critical race theorists and agitators and activists who are fighting to end racism will say things like, the whole system is shot through with racism. And this is what they mean. So don't be too quick to shoot at them. What they mean is the culture of Western civilization preferences people who can adopt and embrace the values of Western civilization. That's what they mean, do you see? It is so dominant, it has a power over everybody. And given that Western civilization culture is capitalistic, unless you embrace core capitalistic values, you can't survive in it or progress in it or succeed. Western capitalistic individualism, profit, free market, competitiveness. Now, I'm going to offer a critique. Don't be too nervous and anxious, you Western democratic capitalists. But don't do the angry, bundle everything together and dismiss it all thing either. Don't assume everyone who embraces this new definition is captivated to Marxism. Don't go there, you see. It's far more nuanced and complex than that. Yes, there are some who are embracing Marxism, but it's not as simple as that, do you see? You know, the great problem is, and this is why I've worked very hard to get the great problem of many of the critiques that are coming out online and so on and so forth, is that they're actually, I think, failing to engage with the insights that are genuinely being perceived. So put yourself into an Aboriginal context. You've lived for centuries, not you personally, of course, but you and your parents, your grandparents, your families, you've lived for centuries in a land where you've raised your family, you've made your way, you've been successful, you've had a lifestyle that works, you've been part of this, hunter-gathering and so on. Then the British come. And that life ends. Your ability to live your way and have your success the way you want success is gone. You have to align with this new culture. Now, it's not just the fact that white people brutalised you and your families and killed and which they did. It was terrible stories. It's not just the fact men did that, the racial bigotry towards you. It's the whole system that was constructed, the culture. Now, can you do the empathetic thing? Can you put yourself into an Aboriginal situation there? How do you feel when this has happened to you? Give me a word. How do you feel? Angry. Betrayed. And then you're told that you have to be like them. Do you see? Now, seeing this helps us critique easy assumptions about the answers to racism. Let me offer this very helpful little book. One of the best books actually I've read on this topic is Beyond Racial Gridlock, and Gordon Yancey. He goes through and indicates that there have been historically 4 different solutions offered for racism: colour blindness, Anglo-conformity, multiculturalism and white responsibility. Now you can quickly pick up what they are, and I'm going to guess, have a think to yourself, which one would you think is the answer? I'll cross my arms. Which one would you think is the answer? Which one do you want to be? Don't say anything, but I'm going to offer a suggestion. Well, no, what Yancey does is very clever. He indicates the first 2 are chosen by conservatives. The second 2 are chosen by minorities. Why is that? Well, you can work it out. Now we've just engaged with Anglo-conformity. Can you see the problem with Anglo-conformity? That we're asking another culture that we've swamped to just let go, get on and be with us now. Wow. But let me pick up colour blindness very quickly. I think most of us, and Martin Luther King certainly had a sense of colour blindness as the one. Can you see any problems with colour blindness? I'll tell you, the critical race theorists note that colour blindness is exactly the theory that white supremacists hold. Do you see why? Let's just not notice colour is okay when you're already succeeding in culture. But it tends you to not notice the challenge for minority groups. Just all get on. Now, there are some major issues there. And so, to the second point. How are you feeling so far? The second point. In critical race theory, one of the key tenets is this: denials of racism are themselves evidence of deeper racism, or the oppressor tends to defend the system that gives them power. True? The oppressor tends not to see, many in critical race theorists would say don't want to see, the shape of the system that they're part of and how it oppresses other people. Now, let's take ourselves out of this so we don't get defensive. Just think about someone else, all right? There's some legitimacy to this, isn't there? Why? Because of human sin. We're all sinful. And we of all people should acknowledge this and see this. The reason there is racism is sin in the human heart. Sin, of course, is about self-serving, me, putting myself at the centre, which will tend to be a position where I protect myself and my advantages. That's what sin does by its very nature. And the problem of sin is so entwined in every human heart that it's very hard to actually see my own guilt. I tend to be blind to the ways it shapes my reactions. And I fear that many of us who are angry about what's happening by the kind of progressive left wing and so on and so forth are blind to what we're bringing to this and what's going on for us in it. It's so often the case that the white guy protesting the claimed racism of the system is blind to his own advantage in the system, or sometimes willfully unwilling to see that the system of Western culture is itself hostile to people of other cultures. I won't see it. Just work hard like I did and you'll succeed. That's the problem. They just need to lift up their socks, get going and work like I worked. The problem is you've given into victim culture and blame shifting. Now, some of that's true. But how does an Aborigine hear that when a white person says that to them? We've lost our culture to you. We've had it taken from us. We can't now live our way. And the only way to succeed is by embracing your culture. And you're telling me now I have to actually get over it and be that. How do you think you feel? I've done lots of stuff on this. I listened to a panel of pastors talking about wokeism and critical race theory. They were very critical of it. They were only critical of it. And there were things to be critical of. I'll come to that in a moment. But as far as they were concerned, there was no true insight in this. And I must confess, as a listener, watching it all, I found myself wanting to be woke. Do you know, I found myself going, you guys don't get it. You don't see what you're bringing to this. It was a real moment for me to feel the problem. You see, denials of racism can themselves be evidence of a failure to see racism. And those denials actually fuel a hostility of those who feel they are oppressed. Our denials fuel their hostility to create a cycle of. And Christians don't engage like that. Brothers and sisters, don't engage like that. Don't go online and social media and smash out these things. 3, understanding is only possible through stories of the oppressed. So one of the key tenets of critical race theory is that understanding is only possible through stories of the oppressed people. The point being made here is that without hearing from people who are actually experiencing oppression, those who are benefiting from the system, the culture as it is, can't see the things wrong with the culture. Now, surely again, there's power to this, isn't there? We do struggle to enter the world of another person, and it's often only when we let them speak and share their stories that we begin to see what we've been blind to. Surely this is a true thought. The Royal Commission. Can I urge you to, two things to read. Well, no, I'm going to give you a bunch of things to read, but go and read the stories in the Royal Commission. Read the actual incidents that they're investigating. Then go and read a book called One Blood. Who's read One Blood? John Harris, yep. It is an extraordinary chronicle of the early missionary efforts in Australia, which is, as far as I can tell, a very honest engagement of what Australians did to the original population that we arrived to see and how missionaries engage. It's quite a fascinating and profoundly disturbing and importantly helpful book for Australian Christians to read. One Blood. Listen to the stories. 4th, one of the other key tenets of critical race theory is that racism is only part of a fully interconnected oppression scheme. Racism is only one part of a fully interconnected oppression scheme. Integral to this movement, critical theory and critical race theory, is the conviction that racism is not only a form of oppression, one race over another, but it's part of a larger tapestry of oppressive structures throughout our society. So, male over female, upper class over lower class, heterosexual over same-sex attracted and trans, old over younger, so that the critical race theorist would say that engaging on the issue of racism leads you to think about all structures of oppression throughout our culture. Now, again, surely there's a truth here. Racism exists because of a human sin, which is the act of making myself at the centre and throwing God off. That will inevitably show itself in me and my race hurting other races. That will happen, but it will also inevitably show itself in me and my sex being over another, or jumping back at, or me and my heteronormative, and so it will surely show itself in all kinds of other ways. And not being naive to this is important, and we've pointed out this by humans, by the nature of sin, will always find ways to take advantage of any strength they have over another. Last, the pursuit of justice must be social, not just personal, or not even personal. Now, we'll come to that in the second session, but the pursuit of justice must be social, and so comes the birth of the modern social justice movement. Critical theory identifies oppressive structures throughout society, males oppressing women, white oppressing black, old oppressing young, minorities being crushed by majorities, and it pursues liberation. It wants to see a society released from oppressive structures and relationships. Now, isn't that a good thing? The desire to rid our world of oppressive structures, is that not a good thing? We applauded the end of slavery. Christians were very involved. We ought to applaud any diminishing of domestic violence and male oppression of women. We ought to be part of that cause. We should surely share the concern that our society would be a fair and equitable place without oppression and abuse. Well, this is much of the insights of critical race theory, and there is much to teach us. But let me pause. Jez, see if there's any questions.
So we've spoken about black and white so far, but what about the Asian connection is the question. There's a little bit more to it, but how does that fit in?
Yeah. There's a difference between Asia and Southeast Asia in these things, and capitalism has not been a dominant feature of Asian culture. Communism has. But one of the features of Asian culture is, sorry, if I might offer two features I think that position them well in a capitalistic setting. Commitment to a family longevity. They look future, and they're committed to a high work ethic. There are two keys to success in a capitalistic society. Pool your resources, and don't think of today, think of tomorrow, and delay gratification. Bang. Success. Yeah. Now, sorry, that doesn't mean there's no racist attitudes from Australia, white Anglos towards Asian culture or Indian culture or, every culture, yeah. Yeah, I know what you're wanting to do. I know what you're doing.
Let me just repeat the question. If we're on stolen land, what are we going to do about it? We're on a nice bit of property here. Are you going to give it back?
Yeah. Some are advocating that, by the way. But the difficulty is if someone steals a car and sells it to a person, and that person, adds on stuff to it and then sells it on to someone else, and they tune it up and then sell it on to someone else, and there's 15 sold. And then we realised 15 back it was stolen. Does that car get given back to the original person? It's very complex. The world just doesn't quite work like that. Now, Mabo, I'm no legal expert, constitutional expert, but my understanding of Mabo is that there was 3 tests that had to be ticked off for land to be regarded as still the possession of the original owners. It was continuity, establishment of a political and social context in that piece of land. So it wasn't just we were here 200 years ago and haven't been for 200 years. It's we've continuously been in this block of land all the way through to now and have set up social and political structures to facilitate its management and so on. So on that basis, Mabo ruled that it was legitimate to acknowledge their ownership of that land. There's the law courts wrestling with that exact question. Yeah. If people own things, they can do what they choose with them. Yeah. We might not agree with what people do with what they own, but that's part of recognising ownership. Yeah. Is it? Yeah. Thank you for assuming such wonderful things of me. I know 2 of those names, Jacinta Price and the first person you mentioned in America. So I can't comment, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
Many events open with a welcome to country. What do you make of that?
Yeah. I have personal views, but not a pastor of church view. Is that a nice dodge? I think it's actually important that this is not about Andrew Hurd's opinions, as Andrew Hurd. This is me seeking to express my responsibility as a pastor. And so I do have opinions, but I must confess even my opinions are somewhat fluid.
Would you partake in a smoking ceremony?
No. No, I wouldn't do that.
As Andrew, as Pastor Andrew, going on there?
As Pastor Andrew.
Yeah.
So we were asked to rent the facilities to a government group that wanted to open their event here with a smoking ceremony, and my conviction, informed biblically, I trust, and appropriately, was to say what's communicated in a smoking ceremony in the minds historically and traditionally is in opposition to my convictions about the spiritual realm and the work of Christ. And so we couldn't condone that in our facility, but be very happy for them to do it somewhere else and then come here and do what they did for the day. They can't remember what Andrew will tell us what they decided to do, but there was our position on that one, yeah.
Let's hit pause much more.
Now, I've just got a couple of people mentioned this. This is very different to what we're used to doing, isn't it? This is not expounding a bit of the Bible and working out how it applies to us. And that's why we're not doing it on a Sunday. Because the priority of Sunday is to declare the gospel, to expound reconciliation between man and God, women and God, mankind, humanity. And so doing it through the week is actually because this is where it fits, do you see? And it is an engagement culturally and so on. Now, something new is happening in our society. There are new insights, ways of thinking, seeing things that I'm contending have brought helpful, important insights. And I want to encourage us on the Central Coast, which many of us are middle class, white, Anglo. Vote Liberal, conservative by disposition and family. Many of us, not all of us. Right? And I want to encourage us, you, because none of that's me. I want to encourage us to think, be humble enough to reflect and consider things we might not have seen before, and learn. That's what we're seeking to do together. Lots to be gained. You know what the next word's going to be? But when you dig down, these thoughts, this new movement, carries ideas and convictions that are incompatible with Christianity. Now, this is very important. These new ideas, as useful as they can be, and many of them can be very useful, don't buy into the simplistic critique that sees a massive culture war and that's all they see, and there's nothing to be... Don't buy into that. It's just naive. These new ideas, as useful as they can be, though, are coming out of a new worldview, a new way of seeing life, the world, ourselves. And seeing this side of things is also critical for us. And I'm going to engage with this under 4 headings, and they kind of add and build together as you go along. So let me give you the first one, which I can't do now, I'm sorry. Brother, what have I got to do here? A new way of thinking about humanity, humans. This new movement has redefined personal identity. See, what makes you, you? What makes you who you are? That's a profoundly important question because it shapes your choices, your priorities. The way you conceive who you are will bring forth a whole bunch of decisions and activities and priorities that will flow out of the way you think about yourself. So your choice about how you identify who you are is very important. Now, what makes me me is a raft of things. Who I am is not a simple thing. There's my history makes me me. My family, my relationships, the language I speak, the skills I have, my gender, my sex, my interests. All of these things are part of who I am, what my body's like, tall, short, round, whatever, colour of hair, all of these things, colour of my skin, these things make me who I am, add together. Now, some of them, though, are more fundamental and more critical to who I am than others. So you've got to prioritise some features of who you are to make sense properly of who you really are. Glenn Harrison, who's the professor and was the head of Department of Psychiatry at Bristol University in the UK, he calls this, what's the title page of your life? You know, what's the foreground, the title you put over all the other pieces that are there? Now, something new's happened, and driven in part by a concern for the marginalised, the hurting, the disenfranchised. There's a growing focus in this new movement and in our society as a whole on personal identity as dominated by the feature that defines the minority group you're part of. Is that a long sentence? There's a new mood to define personal identity as being dominated, the title page, by the feature that defines the minority group you belong to. So, if you're an oppressed black person, then the feature that defines who you are is that you're black. That's who you are. That's your title page, you see. If you're an Indigenous Australian, then that's who you are because that defines your minority status, you see, Indigenous. Now, this has been important. There's much that commends this because it actually enables the rest of us to have attention drawn to the plight of that particular group, you see. So identity in this fashion's got some strengths. It mobilises people. Now, this is not just a race thing. This relates to gender and sexuality. So minority group, if you're a part of the gay minority, same-sex minority group, then you identify as gay. You see, that's the title page. If you're trans, then you identify as trans. You see, this becomes the title page. Now, does any of this matter? It is different from classic Western ways of thinking. Western culture is more individualistic. I am who I am apart from the group I belong to. I'm not defined by the group I belong to in Western culture, but this new movement's actually saying you are defined by the group you belong to, particularly the minority group. Now, it is more akin to Eastern than Western. Who you are is defined by the collective you belong to. And it brings some practical consequences. The more you emphasise the minority group you belong to and its identity that shapes it as a minority group, the more you emphasise that as your identity, as fundamental to your identity, the more the larger community you're part of fragments. This is an absolute simple consequence. Identity then becomes a basis for dividing large populations out from each other. That's not good, yeah? But the deeper consequences of this relates to a new set of duties and obligations. We're going deep tonight, aren't we? This new way of thinking about identity relates to a new set of duties and obligations. You see, if the fundamental thing about me is that I'm a member of the black community, then the most important moral duty I have is to that group. Do you see? I mean, if the fundamental thing about you is that you're a mother, if that's your title page, the way you think about yourself is, you ask me who I am, I go, I'm a mother first and foremost, then that actually shapes your fundamental duties and obligations. That actually tells us something about your fundamental, which is that to make sure I'm a good mum. Love my kids, you see. That tells us what you will do with that identity. If the most fundamental thing about a person is the subculture they belong to, the race that they belong to, the colour of their skin, then the most important duty they'll have is to that race. The most important obligation they'll have is to the success of that minority group. This is a massive shift in society in recent years. And this is exactly what's happening. If you're alert too, this will remind you of an older movement called Marxism, where the collective was your identity and personal individual rights within it were subsumed under the rights and good of the collective. Do you see? Well, that's something of what's happening with this new movement, you see. It's a different worldview to the biblical worldview, and it's profoundly different, but subtly different. See, fundamental in the biblical worldview to human identity, what's the title page for human identity in the biblical worldview? What's fundamental to who we are as humans in the biblical worldview? That we are creatures made by a loving God in his image. The first 3 chapters of the book of the Bible is about your identity. Fundamental to who we are. And this becomes the basis of our moral duties. You know, Genesis chapter 9, you shall not kill. Why? Chase it up. Or was it Genesis 6? I actually didn't look this one up. Is it Genesis 6 or 9? You shall not kill because in the image of God they've been made. 6, 9. Both places. And so, if I'm made in the image of God as a creature under him, then my moral duties and obligations are shaped by that fundamental identity, which is this: it matters how I treat another human, because they're also made in the image of God, with the dignity that comes with that. Whatever their racial group, they're of one blood with me. They share my fundamental identity as a creature in the image of God. Whatever their status, whatever their power, whatever I think of their politics, I have an obligation to treat every other individual as someone also in the image of God with the dignity that brings. I ought therefore treat every individual with respect, kindness, grace, generosity, because they share the same image I share. So, if I fight for the rights of a minority group, the way I treat members of the other group I'm fighting against matters. Do you see? It matters how I treat the people I'm against, if my identity is grounded in being an image bearer and them as well. Now, what's emerging in these recent years is a conflict of these worldviews, the way we think about humankind, the way we conceive identity. It's profound. And the question to ask is it true that my first moral obligation is to the Creator or to my identity group? Changes everything. Now, you've heard what I think, because we started with the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, because the fundamental thing of who I believe we are is made in the image of that God, to know and love that God, you see. And wonderfully, if things are as the Bible insists they are, that our identity is to be found there, then it has the power to empower unity through all humanity, because what unites us together is greater than what separates us apart. Our fundamental unity amongst different racial groups is we're all image bearers of God. We're all one blood, you see. So that promotes unity and coming together. Now let me apply this first sort of new way of thinking about humans. Friends, here it is. Identity is a given. You are who you are. You have your history, the body shape, though you can change that somewhat, but not much. The skills, interests, family, all those things are given. That's just who you are. You don't have many options with it, right? But how you value that raft of different pieces that make up who you are, what you make the title page, what you make the fundamental piece, you get to choose how you think about what's the fundamental thing of who you are, and that choice has far-reaching consequences. Get it right. Get it right. It plays out in reconciliation. Let me give you an application of this into reconciliation. George Yancey, this book I've mentioned to you, he draws attention, his principle of reconciliation is mutual responsibility. Mutual responsibility. So let me play this out for you. White majority people, especially those who have done well in our current capitalistic Western society, middle class people and upper middle class and so on. So I'm speaking to you right now. You have benefited from the culture that took over from the original one that was here. You didn't take over. You weren't back then. But you've benefited from what they did. You are not self-made, you are part of the commonwealth that has been created by the occupying of this land at the expense of the original inhabitants. Recognise that truth. This is your responsibility. Recognise it did come at the expense of the well-being of the Aboriginal population. And acknowledge the power of history and culture to disadvantage the Aboriginal community. And so have compassion for them and concern for them. There's pathologies that work their way through societies based on history, and there is a pathology that's worked its way through that cultural society that our forebears, or the group that we have benefited from, brought to play in their lives. Acknowledge that. Be compassionate. If you are part of a minority black culture, Indigenous, actually any minority culture, can I say some words to you from someone who is the majority culture? But can I say to you as your pastor, you are first and foremost an individual image bearer of Christ. You are not first and foremost identified by your racial group. That is part of who you are, but it's not your fundamental. You are first and foremost an image bearer. And the dignity of that means that you are not at the mercy of your circumstances. Don't buy into victimhood. Don't buy into victimhood. Yancey offers a solution that requires both parties to take responsibility from both sides. Do you see? Not tell the other side how to be, but take personal responsibility for their side, show compassion, take responsibility from the other side to not give in to victimhood and imagine you are at the mercy of circumstances. Can I broaden this, though, to the young men and young women amongst us? You are not your sexuality. If you're same-sex attracted, that's not who you are. If you're opposite-sex attracted, that's not who you are. It's a feature of your identity, but it's not who you are. You are not at the mercy of your inclinations. You are not a victim of your upbringing, your cultural group, your ethnicity. You are an image bearer, and the dignity of being an image bearer is that you are a responsible agent who can make choices and decisions that are real and will make a difference in your life. Don't keep blaming circumstances. Take charge. And if you're finding that hard to do, get help to do it. Take responsibility, you see. Because that's the glory of being a human. I think what it is to be a human is to be a responsible agent made in the image of God, because that's what it is to be made in the image of God. Don't deflect responsibility. Hear me? Yeah? Let's hit the next one. This new modern movement presents a challenge to the biblical worldview with respect to identity, but it also creates a new way of thinking about human relationships. It changes the way we think about ourselves, but it changes the way we think about human relationships. This new movement sees the world through the lens of oppression. It sees the world through the lens. If you are black, you are oppressed. If you're white, you're an oppressor. Now, this is not just in race relations, it's in every set of relationships. Now, there's a very famous book written in America called White Fragility. It's the kind of #1 bestseller on race issues, and Robin DiAngelo, and I meant to bring my copy because I haven't got a picture of it for you, but listen to what she says. For every social group, there is an opposite group. The primary groups that we name are race, class, gender, sexuality, nationality, and so on. So what Robin DiAngelo says is that you can divide all of society up into sub-social groups, and every sub-social group, or these main ones particularly, will have an opposite oppressed-oppressor dynamic. This is the way this new view sees the world. Now, is that the right way to see the world? That every group exists in conflict, oppressed-oppressor. It's part of the new dynamic. Is it true, and does it matter? Or does it matter? The practical consequence is a growing hostility because of this way of viewing the world. You follow it through. If you position people in identity groups, so you are black, you are Asian, you are same-sex. If you position people and make their main identity the defining feature of their minority group, and you classed each of those groups as existing in a state of oppression, you will have an interest in noticing every expression of oppression, no matter how small it is. Every micro-oppression will be necessary to notice because it reinforces the narrative you have around society being in this state of oppression, oppressed. So there's a motivation to want to notice every micro-oppression. And this unwaveringly will bring greater division in society, which is exactly what's happening. Exactly what's happening. Now let me offer, there's another way to view relationships. This is viewing relationships through the lens of oppression, but there's another way to view relationships. Let me give you this other way. It's through the lens of grace, generosity, goodwill, love. You know, it's noteworthy in our modern culture. If you've not read this book, it's a great book to read, Madness of Crowds, Douglas Murray. In his book, he recounts the fact that our modern culture, this modern critical race theory and the kind of the critical theory of the way it's shaped our society, is there's now no forgiveness in modern society. And he lays out ways in which modern culture locks us into and looks for missteps. It actually is on the prowl. So a politician, we are looking for ways to, as much as possible, twist what's being said to demonstrate some evil, oppressive evil. We're looking for it as a society now. And we're now looking to find things people said decades ago and rehash them as if they were said yesterday, even though they've apologised for them. Social media means we're forever in the present, even though people said things in the past. And there's no way you can actually get forgiveness anymore because it can't be forgiven and forgotten. Let me see if this has come up for us. Yes, I picked this up. Can you read that? Actually, I can't read that. We can disagree and still be friends does not apply to racism, sexism, homophobia and transphobia. Do you see? There is the culture we're living in, which is brutal, harsh, unforgiving. If you don't agree with me on this, cut off, you see. But there's another way to view the world, and it's through the lens of grace, generosity, goodwill. Now, this new culture is very different from the protest cultures of Martin Luther King Jr. He said, hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. This modern culture has none of that value running through it. And it's a movement that therefore betrays its roots, which is not in Christianity, but in a very different philosophy. We are in a new world that is increasingly divisive because of the lens through which society is now being viewed. And brothers and sisters, this is our choice as Christians. If you follow the Lord Jesus, who has forgiven you, if you have been forgiven much, view people through the lens of grace and goodwill. Don't find the worst possible read on social media as you talk with people. We are to love our enemies. Now, depending on where you sit in the political realm, for some of you, your enemy is the Black Lives Matter people. Can you love them from the heart? If you sit on the kind of progressive side, the enemies are the CEOs of mining corporations, coal mining. Can you love them from the heart? Don't bring in hate, you see. Don't hate on people and be quick to find fault. There are times you need to stand for things, but take care as you do it. Third, the next critique I want to offer is that this way of seeing the world has an only negative way of seeing authority and hierarchy. It has an only negative way of seeing authority and hierarchy. Now, follow this with me. There's a few steps to follow here. Oppression is bad. All agreed? Amen. Oppression is bad. Agreed? Yeah, very half-hearted. You must be evangelical or something like this. But oppression is bad. But this new movement says that every form of authority of one person over another is by definition oppressive. This is a game changer. According to key critical race theorists, every form of one over another is a form of oppression. So this is Imran Kendi, a very famous speaker, political guy in America. To be an anti-racist is to be a feminist. We cannot be anti-racist if we are homophobic or transphobic. Do you see? It's all of a piece. If you're going to rid the world of racism, you cannot do that unless you're also feminist and egalitarian and also for accepting of homosexuality and transgender. And if you can't do that, you can't end racism. This is massive. You see, there's much more going on in all of this than a concern simply about racism, which is why we're actually now moving out of racism into other issues. There's much, much more going on. In many places, and deeply within this movement, is a pursuit to end oppression, which is a desire to end all oppression. But follow this. Now, that's good, yeah? But follow this. Oppression in this movement is defined as any system of thought that preferences one way over another, one person over another. Any system that creates a hierarchy, a dominance of one thing over another, the truth, an opinion of some over the opinions of others. Any of that is oppressive, any authority. Now remember, I'm endorsing people's concern to end racial oppression. It's biblical, we all have all, but coming along in the train of end racial oppression, which is a good and proper thing, coming along in that train is a deeper principle that that's just one expression of authority of one people over another. All authority of anyone over another is oppressive. Any expression of one group over another, any one idea that stands over another. The Christian philosophy that stands over Western society and is preferenced in our culture is oppressive because there's an authority over, do you see? Sexual, heteronormative is oppressive because it preferences one sexuality over others. Now, most of us already have imbibed this flavour. It's hard not to. We live in a world that's driving this at us. I'm going to get in the same-sex marriage debate. To stand for marriage between a man and a woman and not vote for same-sex marriage as an acceptable way felt like I was insisting there was only one way to do marriage, and that felt oppressive, didn't it? It's already here amongst us, you see. We are increasingly uncomfortable with preaching to people because that sets up the idea that there's one person who tells you, oh, that seems oppressive. We've already drunk this drink. Now, dig into this with me. Is it right that every expression of authority of one person over another is oppressive? Is that concept, now that's the principle being offered here, but is that concept right, that one person over another is always oppressive? Let me give you an illustration that I hope you still agree with. Parents over a child, oppressive? Well, it can be abusive, but no. It's not necessarily oppressive, but by definition, the critical race theory, and many critical theorists hold this view, that age ought not to be over younger. Now, Why don't most of us accept that at the moment? I think many of us will begin, but why don't we accept? Because, here we go, we bring another lens to relationships, the lens of love. So the critical race theorists bring the lens of oppression. Everything's an oppressed oppressor. And they bring the lens that any authority over is by nature oppressive. But we bring a lens of love to authority structures because Jesus did. Now, this is simple but complex. The Bible presents authority as an expression of love. And it's to be exercised in love, where love is modelled on the greatest Lord of authority, Jesus, who is the greatest authority. But how did he love? He loved by dying to save those he ruled. You know that statement, love is love. It hasn't given us any content for love. It doesn't help us at all to think about love, right? But there's a statement in the Bible, 1 John chapter 4, this is love. Now, how do you finish that sentence? Not because you know the verse, but how would... This is love. This really is love. What would you say that this really is love? Well, how does the verse end? This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and gave his son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. That's love, to die for the good of the other. You see, the Bible's view of love is acting for the interests of the one that is loved, sacrificing yourself for them. And the Bible tells us that that's how we're to read authority, through that lens. Matthew chapter 20, verse 25. You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over you, but not so with you. Whoever wants to become great amongst you must be your servant. You see what Jesus is doing? He's saying, follow me. I'm in authority, but my authority is exercised as love. I die for the sake of the ones I'm in authority over. That's not oppression. He upends human patterns. Authority structures and hierarchies still exist. They're not inherently evil if they're cast through the lens of love, for the sake of those that are led to serve their interests. This is utterly profound. Authority and hierarchy is not itself oppressive. It can be, but its intention biblically is to be an expression of sacrifice and service for the good of the one that's being led. Now, I'm not sure I have time, but no, I won't have time. Now, we have already drunk from this movement, and we need to consciously recalibrate. Heterosexuality. You've heard that phrase, heteronormative. It's the critique of heterosexuality as the norm by which all ought to be measured and conformed to. And that is oppressive in this new modern movement. But is heterosexuality inherently oppressive as a norm? Well, it's a biblical norm, and it is easy to feel as if it is somehow harmful to people of other sexual orientations, that somehow it's oppressive to them. But the Bible would present it to us as a gift of love from God, that heterosexuality is a pattern of life that best enables human flourishing. Do we believe that? Do we believe that? Think with me further. Male eldership. Male eldership. It's increasingly difficult to commend that in our public platforms because people read it immediately as an expression of oppression over women. But is it necessarily so? The Bible, get this, the Bible is from beginning to end one massive word of authority designed to rule every human. That's an oppressive structure if there is one, isn't it? Jesus, as the only way to be reconciled to God, which means the missionary movement requires us to go out to others and bring them to the truth, that feels oppressive because I'm saying I've got it and you haven't. That feels like I'm superior. That feels oppressive. Critical race theory says, get rid of it. What do you think of these things? It's a clash of worldviews. Is every authority, order, hierarchy inherently oppressive? Or can they be read through the lens of love and be actually about sacrifice for the service of others? and so not oppressive at all. Fourth, we're getting there, a redefinition of social justice. We're now getting into the deeper and bigger ones. The modern movement is big on the issue of social justice. It's in the foreground for it. And you might find yourself marvelling at the fact that the pagan world has embraced something that we care deeply about. And how wonderful is that? Perhaps God's at work and there's something good that's going on here, isn't it? You might find yourself, but here's the thing. What they mean by social justice is not what we mean. See, what is social justice? Well, we think it's making sure everyone's treated justly before the law. Justice reigns, you see, in the society we're in. But here's a definition. Social justice is the elimination of all forms of oppression. Now add to that what we've already seen, which is a form of oppression, is any authority and norm that exists over another person. And social justice is eradicating any hierarchy and authority throughout our world and enabling everyone and anyone to live the way they want without any expectation or demand over them. It's very different to what we think social justice is, you see. You see, you can't be against racism and not a feminist. And the end game of all of this is equality, which again sounds wonderful. And social justice warriors will talk about equality, but they mean something different. When we mean equality, we tend to think of equality of opportunity. But what this modern movement says is equality of outcome. They're very different equalities. And let me try and illustrate. Time's getting away from us, but let me try and illustrate. Men and women, what will society look like when men and women are equal? One of the measures that this movement in our modern society is bringing to test whether we're equal is the pay gap. So if we average out every woman's pay and every man's pay across Australia, and if that doesn't equal the same thing, then there's inequality. But what it's measuring is equality of outcome. Because to have the same pay averaged across every woman and man, for that to equal the same amount, what does society have to look like? What it has to look like is every woman, every profession, every job having 50% men and women represented in them. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, if every profession has 50-50, then the only way we can get that outcome is by forcing women, particularly, to do what they don't want to do. Because men and women left to themselves choose different paths. Many women actually want to be at home with their kids and take time out of work and maybe not even go back to work. But if equality of outcome, if equality equals everyone with the same pay, we can't let them do that. So what pay gap is actually representative of a healthy society? It's not equivalence. The only way to get there is by totalitarianism. You see, a very different view of equality, very different view of oppression, very different view of social justice. The point is, under the guise of social justice, we are being offered a very different view of human society. Should churches get involved in social justice movements? Not when they're like that. Should you get involved in social justice movements? Well, it's a choice you need to make. But just be aware, it may not be what you think it is. It may have a different agenda than you realise. And the danger here is for warm-hearted Christians. We buy into the front end, social justice, but we're brought into the back end, which slowly undermines the fundamental biblical convictions that actually shape who we are. And some Christian leaders have said, this is the greatest error facing the church today, and I think that's right. That's why I'm so concerned for us to get together and spend time on this. Last, and more seriously still, a new way of knowing or coming to the truth. Very briefly, I offered in the first session that there's a new way of thinking, which is that to truly know, we need to hear the voices of the oppressed. There's a truth to that. But carried along with that helpful observation is an utterly profound new way of thinking about knowledge. Are you alert enough to get this one? Carried along with that is a whole new way of thinking about coming to the truth. And it's utterly profound. This new movement says we only have access to the truth through lived experience. That is, it's only possible for an oppressed person to speak about the issues of oppression, truly. You cannot have a white guy talk truthfully about race relations. You need a person of colour. Because I am not able to access the truth, you see, is this newer view. Now notice the shift. There is value in hearing the experiences of oppressed people. Yes. It helps us see blind spots. But to say that only a person of colour can speak on this issue is a very different situation. And this shift has happened and brought us into a deep, profound shift, so that a book, Margaret Anderson and Patricia Hill, say the idea that objectivity is best reached through rational thought is specifically Western and masculine. And the book argues against that. Wow. Now, ironically, the view that you can only know the truth through a person who is oppressed to give you the truth is itself oppressive. That rule oppresses us in our ability to speak. Everyone needs to speak. We can't rule who can and can't, because the truth is not a private domain. It's public, accessible to all of us, whatever your nationality, race, colour, whatever it is. And we need to fight for that. Now, brothers and sisters, this is coming through our Christian world. I'm going to suggest it's a slow train crash coming at us. The train's crashing and it's coming slowly. And the key for us is to be alert to these things. Let me pause there and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, bunch. Can you give us a quick definition of what woke theory is and Marxism? Just really quick hit. A few people have asked, what's that about?
Yeah, right. Wokeism is a term that's being used to say you've been awakened, you've woken up to the problems of Western civilization and its culture. You've now seen what you weren't seeing before. You've been awoken. And so wokeism is a lot of what I presented earlier would come under the category of someone who's woke. They've woken up.
And Marxism?
Marxism is it's a theory of society which is made up of oppressors and oppressed, and it's largely driven by the economics of bourgeois and the proletariat, the people, so that the owners of capital oppress the workers and force them to have lower wages, and they gain more and more, and so on. And so Marxism says it goes back to another bloke earlier than him, but there's this conflict that's set up in that context, and Marx would say that eventually will destroy itself and a new culture will emerge. Now that got, Marxism is back in the kind of late 1800s, shapes Stalin communism, but it flows through into a thing called the Frankfurt School, if you want to chase all this stuff up. Anyway, there you go.
Isn't evangelism similar to asking someone to give up their culture? How do we navigate not wanting to suppress culture racially whilst also asking people to give up their culture to become Christians?
Yeah. When I'm evangelising someone, what I'm calling them to do is to become fully human, truly human, the human that God made them to be. And there are certain features that we were made to live, certain shape that is designed by God for us. That we understand ourselves as image bearers, that we live with dignity and responsibility, that we don't just think for the present, that we think about future, that we seek to love and serve others, that we reproduce and multiply ourselves. There's various features that are just part of the fabric of how God has made us to be. And I'm calling people back to the life that God designed you to have. Now, the challenge for us is that we can confuse the kind of core tenets of what God calls us to. We can confuse that with the culture of the one bringing the message. And that's that's not an easy activity to tease out what's my culture and what's purely integral to what it is to be a person of God under Him, lived in your culture. That is a really challenging thing to pull off. So the early missionaries in Australia struggle with this massively. Some of them got it better than others, but largely they brought British culture along with the gospel, and it poisoned their evangelism. Because to be a Christian was to give up being nomadic, live on a farm, wear certain clothes.
So calling people to Christ is to call them to a new headline, title page, as you put it.
Yeah.
But not necessarily get rid of all the other factors that make up our identity. Is that fair?
That's fair. But working out what all that is complex. It's easier across races, I think, than subcultures. So anyway. I think a lot about this, and it's complex, it's tricky.
Someone asked...
I have a friend who does ministry in Sydney in a multicultural, very, very multicultural area. And he says the biggest divide is not racial, actually, it's subculture, it's class. So he has, 50 different nationalities represented. He says middle class of different racial backgrounds easily mix, but them mixing with different class is much, much harder. Yeah, interesting.
Someone asked, am I a racist because I happen to be born white into Australia, Western culture, apparently with the privilege that goes with it? How am I culpable for things beyond my actions or motivations?
Yeah. Good. So critical race theory actually insists, so Robin DiAngelo, the book White Fragility, the key thing she's driving at is that if you're white, in America particularly, but if you're white, then you are racist by definition. And every protest that you're not reinforces that you really are, because you're blind to your participation in a system that oppresses others. So you are racist by definition. Now, I want to offer, what I've tried to argue is that that trades on a corporate identity process that I am my race. But what I want to offer is that biblically, I am an individual, personally responsible under God to others, so I'm not to blame for the actions of other people. But where I have benefited from the blameworthy actions of other people, I need to acknowledge it. See the difference? I was a supporter of the apology. I thought that was a wonderful moment in Australian history. And it wasn't because I personally pushed the Aboriginal population out, but the representative of our government that had come from the fruit of that action, he was able to represent our society, its continuity back there, to say we're sorry. I think that was a profound. It's interesting in the Bible, you do get this communal. One of the problems with Western civilization, you'll notice that lots of what I've talked about actually does appear in Western culture, this kind of responsibility, dignity issue. It's because Western civilization, here it is, Western civilization owes its roots to Christianity. Western is because we grew out of Christianity. Now, we grew out of Christianity, but because of various other historical features, we've perverted it. And so individualism was, this kind of idea of personal responsibility, human dignity, and so it comes out of Christianity. It's come its way through Western civilization. We've perverted it to make it radical individualism where there's no communal responsibilities. And so many conservatives hated the apology because they said, I didn't do it, I wasn't there. While they sat in their houses benefiting from all that was done all those centuries ago. Now, you see it in the Bible. Daniel, there's various places you'll see this in the Bible where apologies are made on the behalf of a corporate group. We're individuals first, title page, and part of a collective. Benefiting from, participating in, yeah.
How do I navigate this new world where my Christian worldview is so very different to the worldview of just about everyone I encounter, when I'm just so tired with trying to keep up and understand, and it just gets harder all the time? Just as a guess, that sounds like a question from someone over 45.
Let's all go on a holiday. Do you think it is? Let's all go on a holiday together. Man, oh man. Living life. See, if you've bought into the Western dream, which is 6-day, 7-day weekend, you'll find life frustrating and annoying. But if you've bought into the vision that God has for us, which is more blessed to give than receive, Acts 20, then of course it's going to be hard work. What did you think? You see, serving God is about loving others. It's not about pursuing my leisure. So of course it's going to be hard work. It is tiring. We gather together. That's why church fellowship is so important, because that's a place where we get nurtured and nourished to think clearly again. But yeah, go back out into the world to love and serve the people you live with and move amongst. That's just our calling for the rest of it. Jesus got tired. He got frustrated with the people he was with. How long have I got to be with you for, says Jesus.
And they're his disciples.
They're the 12 that started the church.
Mm.
Yeah. Loose translation. But yeah.
Are ethnic churches biblical, as in an Asian church, Chinese church? Or are multi-ethnic churches biblical?
You've got in... Now we're talking about the constitution of a church, which is a gathering of people. That's what church is. You've got the challenge of missional aims, missionary aims, and maturity aims. And those two things conflict. Let me tell you how. If all I'm thinking about is reaching people for the gospel and saving more people, I'll build an homogenous unit church, a single ethnic church, a single subculture church, you see, because there's fewer barriers for a person of that subculture or culture to join. So it's easier to actually reach people from a particular culture if the church you'll bring them to is exactly the same culture. You see? So mission's much easier like that. But it undermines maturity. Because the cause of the gospel is to mature us, to move with people who don't share our culture simply because they love Jesus like I love Jesus. So maturity is to be together and have break down barriers and have people from all different nationalities and all different subcultures together. That's how you mature each other. You get over this preciousness about, oh, there's not people my age. Oh, there's not people who surf or do have... You get over that in maturity and you kind of grow up to be someone who loves Jesus. They love Jesus, I love them. So maturity comes from everyone together. Mission gets better when it's just one. There you go. So what to do?
We'll do one more. Unless it's quick, we'll do two more. I think you've touched on this as you've gone through, but someone is saying, okay, what impact does this have on my life tomorrow? How should my life look different because of knowing this stuff? And if it doesn't look different, then what's been the point of tonight? Is the question.
Yeah. Look, a bunch of things. Learn to listen. Learn to be humble. Learn to pay attention to people who are different to you. Learn to appreciate the benefits you have accrued because of your culture. Learn to appreciate that. Give thanks to God. It's not evil that you benefit from those things, but know that you do. So there's lots of learning there to be had for ourselves. And begin to take an interest in race relations, particularly in Australia. Learn about our early church history, our early Australian history. And if you've not read in that area or looked, I hope you're shocked, because you should be. What we did, what my forebears and many of your forebears did was just horrendous. It was horrible. And I probably there, but the grace of God, I'd be there too, you know. So learn some compassion, take an interest, and begin to relate differently to the environment and political movements around you. Be more patient with efforts at reconciliation with Indigenous Australians. Don't be the voice of cynicism and critique all the time. Be more patient with it. Because the more that we take responsibility for compassion and care and grace, the more there'll be an environment where responsibility on the other side can be taken and we can see some health emerge in a dysfunctional society. Be prayerful, and be equipped from tonight to know how to evangelise better. There's a bunch of things.
It's helpful. Would you finish our time in prayer for us?
Sure, let's do that. Well, Heavenly Father, the world we live in is fallen. You know that. We acknowledge sin is so pervasive, so corrupted us. And we're conscious of our part in that and we're sorry. Please forgive us. Please forgive us our cultural blindness. Please forgive us the ways in which we have traded on our privileges without the gratitude we ought to have. Please forgive us the times that we've been dismissive and scoffing of concerns around Indigenous Australians. Please forgive us for that. Help us be humble and begin to listen better. Help us be prayerful. But Father, we do ask for us here as a church that you might make us a place that genuinely takes heed to cultures that are different to our own, that this church might be a place that welcomes people from all different backgrounds and cultures, and that we genuinely know how to love each other. Please continue to grow this place full of people from every tribe, language, nation. Please make it a place that welcomes and loves and is patient and gracious towards each other. And in all of this, show the glory of your gospel that truly is the answer to our world's problems. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. It's been good to be together. I hope that was helpful. Good night. God bless.